The wind howled like a wounded animal as Vincent Vaughn pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders, squinting through the relentless snowfall that had ambushed him on his journey back to Unionville, Nevada. December 1876 was proving to be one of the harshest winters the Sierra Nevada mountains had seen in decades, and he cursed his decision to delay his return journey from Carson City after selling his season's cattle. "Easy, Maverick," he murmured to his stallion as the horse snorted and tossed his head nervously. The path ahead was becoming increasingly difficult to discern as twilight descended, and the snow accumulated in deceptive drifts. Vincent knew these trails like the back of his hand, having spent his 28 years in this rugged country, but tonight even the familiar was transformed into something treacherous. He'd promised his ranch hands he'd be back before the storm hit. Now, as the temperature plummeted and ice crystals formed in his mustache, he regretted not heeding the warning signs that had been present in the heavy gray clouds that morning. Vincent was about to turn Maverick toward a sheltered ravine where they could wait out the worst of the blizzard, when something caught his eye, a dark shape against the pristine white of a snowbank just off the trail. "Hold up," he commanded, pulling back on the reins. Maverick stomped nervously as Vincent dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. The wind momentarily subsided, and in that brief respite from the howling, Vincent heard a sound that chilled him more than the frigid air a weak moan carried on the gusting breeze. Drawing closer to the dark shape, his heart hammered when he realized it was a person, half buried in the snow. Quickly kneeling, he brushed away the accumulating white powder to reveal the unconscious form of a young woman. Her face was ashen, lips tinged blue, and her dark lashes rested against deathly pale cheeks. "Miss," Vincent called, gently shaking her shoulder. "Miss, can you hear me?" No response came from her still form. Her clothes, a traveling dress of fine quality beneath a woolen cloak, were frozen stiff, and a small valise lay nearby, partially covered by the drifting snow. What in God's name was a woman doing alone on this mountain trail during a blizzard? Vincent didn't waste time pondering the question. He pressed his fingers to her neck, relieved to feel a faint pulse fluttering beneath his touch. She was alive, but wouldn't remain so for long in these conditions. Unionville was still nearly 20 miles away, down treacherous mountain paths. The closest shelter was his own ranch, which lay in the same direction. There was no choice to make. He had to get her to safety, and quickly. "Sorry about this, madam," Vincent muttered as he scooped her up in his arms. She weighed hardly anything, and her body was frighteningly cold against his chest. Grabbing her valise with one hand, he trudged back to Maverick. The stallion whinnied in protest as Vincent carefully positioned the unconscious woman in the saddle before climbing up behind her. He secured her against his chest with one strong arm while taking the reins with his free hand. "It's going to be a long night, boy," he told the horse, steering him back toward the trail that led home. "We've got to make it. She won't survive otherwise." Vincent estimated the temperature had dropped well below freezing. The snow continued to fall heavily, obscuring the path and forcing him to rely on instinct and Maverick's sure-footedness. The woman in his arms remained unconscious, her breathing shallow, and he found himself constantly checking to ensure she still lived. "Stay with me," he whispered, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just stay with me." Hours passed, each minute stretching painfully as Vincent battled exhaustion and cold. His hands grew numb despite his thick leather gloves, and he feared frostbite would set in before they reached safety. Still, he pushed on, frequently stopping to rub feeling back into his extremities and to check on his unconscious charge. As midnight approached, the snowfall finally began to ease, and Vincent caught a glimpse of the valley below. The lights of Unionville were still far off, but the sight gave him renewed determination. His own ranch lay on the outskirts of town, perhaps another 10 miles away. The woman stirred slightly in his arms, a small moan escaping her blue lips. "That's it," Vincent encouraged. "Fight, miss. We're getting there." The path grew steeper as they descended, and Vincent had to dismount and lead Maverick by the reins, carrying the woman in his arms to distribute the weight more evenly. His muscles screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth and continued his grueling march. By the time the silhouette of his ranch house appeared against the night sky, Vincent was nearly delirious with fatigue. The 20-mile journey had taken more than 8 hours through the brutal conditions, and dawn was approaching. But they had made it. "Vincent, good God, man." The shout came from his foreman, Thomas Miller, who had apparently spotted them approaching and rushed out into the yard. "We thought you were lost to the storm. Help me with her," Vincent managed through chattering teeth, staggering the final few steps toward the house. "Found her. In the snow. Barely alive." Thomas's eyes widened as he took in the unconscious woman in Vincent's arms. Without further questions, he helped support Vincent as they carried her into the warmth of the ranch house. "Maggie," Thomas called for his wife, who served as the ranch's cook. "Heat water and bring blankets. Lots of them." Vincent gently laid the woman on the sofa nearest the fireplace, where embers still glowed. His hands trembled with cold and exhaustion as he removed her frozen cloak. Maggie hurried in, gasping when she saw the situation. "Lord have mercy, who is she?" "Don't know," Vincent replied, collapsing into a nearby chair as the warmth of the house began to thaw his frozen limbs. "Found her half buried in snow up near Eagle Pass. No sign of a horse or companions." Maggie, a robust woman in her 50s who had helped raise Vincent after his mother died, immediately took charge. "Thomas, stoke that fire until it's roaring. Vincent, you need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. I'll tend to the girl." Vincent nodded weakly, but his eyes remained fixed on the woman's face. Now, in the light of the ranch house, he could see she was beautiful despite her pallor, high cheekbones, a delicate nose, and full lips that had begun to regain some color in the warmth. "Go on," Maggie insisted, shoving him toward his bedroom. "You've done your part bringing her here. Let me do mine." Reluctantly, Vincent retreated to change. His thoughts remained with the mysterious woman he had rescued as he peeled off his frozen clothing and donned dry garments. Who was she? What had brought her to that remote mountain trail alone? And would she survive the ordeal? When he returned to the main room, Maggie had removed the woman's outer garments and wrapped her in warm blankets. A kettle steamed on the stove, and Maggie was carefully spooning warm broth between the woman's lips. "She's starting to come around," Maggie informed him. "Her fingers and toes show no signs of severe frostbite, thank the Lord. You got to her in time." Vincent felt relief wash over him as he sank into a chair beside the sofa. "Has she said anything?" "Not yet, but she's swallowing the broth, which is a good sign." Maggie studied him critically. "You look half dead yourself. When's the last time you ate?" Vincent couldn't remember. "Yesterday morning, I suppose. Sit there. I'll fix you something." As Maggie bustled to the kitchen, Vincent found himself studying the woman's face. She seemed young, perhaps in her early 20s. Her dark hair, now drying in the warmth of the fire, fell in waves around her face. There was a refinement to her features that suggested education and good breeding. A soft moan drew his attention, and Vincent leaned forward as her eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, her gaze unfocused. Then her eyes, a striking shade of green, fixed on his face, and alarm replaced confusion. "Easy," Vincent said softly, raising his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "You're safe." "Where?" Her voice was barely audible, cracked from cold and disuse. "My ranch, just outside Unionville, Nevada. I found you unconscious in the snow up on Eagle Pass." She blinked slowly, processing this information. "The coach. There was an accident." "A stage coach?" Vincent asked. She nodded weakly. "The driver lost control on the ice. The coach went over." Her eyes suddenly widened with renewed panic. "The others?" Vincent shook his head grimly. "I didn't see any coach or other passengers, just you half buried in the snow. Was there anyone else?" The driver and a man traveling to Virginia City. Tears filled her eyes. They couldn't have survived the fall. Vincent reached out awkwardly, patting her hand through the blanket. "I'll send men to search as soon as it's light, but the storm." She nodded in understanding, a tear slipping down her pale cheek. "How did I?" "You must have been thrown clear somehow," Vincent suggested. "It's the only explanation for why you were on the trail and not at the bottom of the ravine." Maggie returned with a steaming bowl of stew for Vincent and more broth for their guest. "Ah, she's awake. That's wonderful news." "I'm Maggie Miller, dear, and this reckless man who carried you 20 miles through a blizzard is Vincent Vaughn." 20 miles? The woman whispered, her eyes returning to Vincent with new wonder. Vincent felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "It wasn't quite that far," he mumbled, though in truth, with the detours forced by the storm, it might have been more. "I'm Nora Kincaid," she said softly. "I can never repay you for what you've done, Mr. Vaughn." "Vincent," he corrected. "And no repayment is necessary, Miss Kincaid." "Anyone would have done the same." Maggie snorted. "Anyone with the strength to carry a grown woman 20 miles through a blizzard, perhaps. Now, Miss Kincaid, can you manage a bit more broth? You need warmth from the inside out." Nora accepted the broth gratefully, though her hands trembled so badly that Maggie had to help her. Vincent watched, oddly captivated by this woman who had nearly died in the snow. There was a quiet dignity about her, even in her weakened state. "Where were you headed?" he asked after she had consumed most of the broth. "Unionville," she replied, surprising him. "I've accepted a position as the new school teacher." Vincent's eyebrows rose. "The school board has been trying to find a replacement for Mrs. Patterson since she retired last spring. The children have been without proper schooling for months." Nora attempted a small smile. "Well, it seems I've arrived, albeit not in the manner I intended." "You're fortunate to be alive," Maggie stated bluntly. "Another hour in that cold and we'd be planning a funeral instead of warming you by the fire." Vincent shot Maggie a reproachful look, but Nora nodded solemnly. "I know," she whispered. "I remember. The cold, how it stopped hurting after a while, how tired I became." Her eyes met Vincent's. "Then nothing until I woke up here." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. The storm had intensified again, rattling the windows of the ranch house. "You'll stay here until you've recovered," Vincent decided. "The town can wait a few more days for their teacher." "I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," he interrupted firmly. "The trails will be impassable for days after this storm anyway. Besides, Maggie would never forgive me if I sent you off before she deemed you ready." Maggie nodded emphatically. "That's right. Now both of you need rest. Vincent, you look ready to drop where you sit." Vincent couldn't argue with that assessment. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the night's ordeal was rapidly fading, leaving crushing exhaustion in its wake. "The blue bedroom is prepared," Maggie told Nora. "Can you walk, or shall Vincent carry you again?" Color bloomed in Nora's pale cheeks. I can try to walk." It became immediately apparent that she could not. When she attempted to stand, her legs buckled beneath her, and Vincent barely managed to catch her before she hit the floor. "I've got you," he murmured, lifting her effortlessly despite his fatigue. Her body felt different now, warmer, more alive than the near-frozen form he'd carried through the night. Nora's arms instinctively encircled his neck, and their eyes met in a moment of unexpected intimacy. Vincent felt something shift in his chest, a stirring he hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath warm against his neck. Vincent carried her down the hallway to the guest bedroom, acutely aware of her softness in his arms. Maggie bustled ahead, turning down the covers of the bed. Once Nora was settled comfortably, Maggie shooed Vincent from the room. "Out with you. The poor girl needs privacy and rest." In his own bedroom, Vincent fell onto his bed fully clothed, too exhausted to even remove his boots. His last thoughts before succumbing to sleep were of green eyes and the strange twist of fate that had brought Nora Kincaid into his life. He awakened to afternoon light filtering through his bedroom window and the realization that he had slept for nearly 8 hours. The storm continued to rage outside, snow piling high against the windows. Vincent washed and changed before making his way to the main room, where he found Thomas warming his hands by the fire. "How bad is it?" Vincent asked, gesturing toward the window. Thomas grimaced. "Worst blizzard I've seen in 15 years. We've already lost one section of fencing on the south pasture. The cattle are huddled in the sheltered areas, but if this continues much longer..." Vincent nodded grimly. Winter was always difficult for ranchers, but a storm of this magnitude could devastate their herd. Any sign of it letting up? "Skies still heavy with snow. Could be another day or two," Vincent sighed. "What about our guest, still sleeping, last I heard?" Thomas eyed him curiously. "Maggie says you carried her 20 miles through the snow." "It wasn't quite that far," Vincent repeated his earlier deflection. Thomas wasn't fooled. "She's pretty, that one, even half frozen." Vincent shot him a warning look, which Thomas answered with a knowing smile before changing the subject. "The men are asking if we should try to search for the stage coach she mentioned." Vincent frowned, glancing toward the window. "Not in this. As soon as the storm breaks, we'll send out search parties, but I fear it will be a recovery mission, not a rescue." Thomas nodded solemnly. "That's what I figured. Poor woman, arriving to a new town with such tragedy." Vincent's thoughts exactly. He wondered what kind of strength it would take for Nora to move forward after such an ordeal, arriving in a strange town with nothing but whatever possessions had been in that small valise he'd recovered. Maggie appeared from the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw Vincent. "There you are, feeling more human now." "Much," he admitted. "How is Miss Kincaid?" "Resting comfortably." She woke briefly and took some more broth, the colors returning to her cheeks. Maggie placed her hands on her ample hips. "That was a brave thing you did, Vincent. Foolish, perhaps, but brave." Vincent shrugged uncomfortably. "As I told Miss Kincaid, anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone could have," Thomas pointed out. "Most men would have frozen alongside her before making it halfway home." Before Vincent could respond, a soft voice interrupted from the hallway. "Then I'm fortunate it was Mr. Vaughn who found me." They all turned to see Nora standing in the doorway, looking pale but steady. She had donned a simple blue dress that Vincent recognized as belonging to Maggie's niece, who occasionally visited the ranch. "Miss Kincaid," Maggie rushed forward. "You shouldn't be up yet." Nora smiled weakly. "I've imposed on your hospitality enough already. Besides, I've never been one for lying abed even after." She trailed off, her expression momentarily haunted. Vincent stepped forward. "Please sit by the fire. You're not imposing in the slightest." She allowed herself to be guided to an armchair near the hearth, though Vincent noted she moved carefully, as if every muscle pained her. "I believe proper introductions are in order," Vincent said. "Miss Nora Kincaid, "This is Thomas Miller, my foreman, and you've already met his wife, Maggie." "A pleasure to meet you both," Nora said with genuine warmth, "and thank you for your kindness." Thomas nodded respectfully. "Madam, glad to see you recovering." "Are you hungry?" Maggie asked. "I could fix you something more substantial than broth now that you're up." "That would be lovely, thank you." As Maggie bustled off to the kitchen, an awkward silence fell. Vincent found himself studying Nora in the daylight, the way the firelight brought out auburn highlights in her dark hair, the intelligence in her green eyes, the gentle curve of her lips. "The storm shows no sign of breaking," he said finally, gesturing toward the window. "You'll be our guest for at least another day or two, I'm afraid." "I'm grateful for the shelter," Nora replied, "though I worry about my position. The school board is expecting me, and I've already delayed my arrival by stopping in Carson City for supplies." "The town will understand, given the circumstances," Vincent assured her. "In fact, once the trail's clear, I'll escort you to town myself and explain the situation to Mayor Dawson." "You're very kind," she murmured. Thomas, seemingly sensing the undercurrent between them, cleared his throat. "I should check on the men. We're rotating shifts to keep the barn and cattle paths clear." After Thomas departed, Vincent sat in the chair opposite Nora. "May I ask what brings a young woman like yourself to a place like Unionville? It's hardly a center of culture and refinement." Nora's expression grew thoughtful. "I was teaching at a girls' seminary in Boston, but I needed a change." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but Vincent didn't press. From Boston to Nevada territory is quite a change indeed. A small smile played at her lips. "Yes, well, perhaps I have a bit of adventurer in me. My father was a surveyor for the railroad. Before he passed, he filled my head with stories of the West." "I'm sorry about your father," Vincent said sincerely. "It was some years ago," she replied. "What about you, Mr. Vaughn? Have you always lived in Nevada?" Vincent nodded. "Born and raised." "My father established this ranch just after the first silver strikes brought people to this region. He died when I was 18, and I've been running it ever since." "It seems to be a substantial operation," Nora observed. "How many acres?" "Just over 8,000, Vincent answered, surprised by her interest. "Not as large as some spreads in Texas or Montana, but respectable for this region." "And do you manage it alone?" "Thomas helps oversee things, and I have about 15 hands depending on the season." Vincent leaned back in his chair. "It's a good life, though not always an easy one." Nora's eyes reflected genuine interest. "I imagine winters like this present particular challenges." "They do, but there's something about this land that gets under your skin." "The space, the silence, the mountains." Vincent trailed off, slightly embarrassed by his uncharacteristic eloquence. "I think I understand," Nora said softly. "Even in the brief glimpses I had during the stagecoach journey, I was struck by the raw beauty of this country." Their eyes met across the space between them, and Vincent felt that same strange stirring in his chest. There was something about this woman, a depth, an intelligence that intrigued him. Maggie returned with a tray bearing a bowl of stew, fresh bread, and coffee. "Here you are, Miss Kincaid. Nothing fancy, but it'll put strength back in your bones." "It looks wonderful," Nora assured her, accepting the tray. "And please call me Nora." As Nora ate, Vincent found himself studying her hands, slender but strong, the hands of someone who worked for a living rather than a pampered socialite. Her table manners were refined but not pretentious, and she ate with healthy appetite. "The stew is delicious," she complimented Maggie. "I haven't had a meal this satisfying since leaving Boston." Maggie beamed with pleasure. "Well, you'll need your strength. Once this storm passes, the real winter begins. January and February can be brutal in these mountains." "I've brought plenty of warm clothing," Nora said, then her expression fell. "Although most of my belongings were in my trunk on the stagecoach." Vincent frowned. "Once we locate the coach, we'll recover whatever we can." "I fear that may be impossible if it went over the edge as I believe it did," Nora replied practically. "But I'm alive, which is more than can be said for poor Mr. Jenkins and the driver." "Were they the only others on the coach?" Vincent asked. Nora nodded. "It was a special run, arranged because the regular stage had been delayed in Carson City due to mechanical issues. Mr. Jenkins was a mining investor headed to Virginia City, and I was the only other passenger willing to risk the weather." Her voice grew quiet. "Perhaps I should have heeded the warnings." "How did you come to be separated from the coach?" Vincent asked, the question that had been bothering him since finding her. Nora's brow furrowed as she tried to recall. "We were ascending a particularly steep section of trail. The horses were struggling in the deep snow, and the driver, Mr. Holloway, I believe his name was, asked us to step down to lighten the load temporarily." Her hands trembled slightly as she continued. "I was walking a short distance behind the coach when I heard the crack. One of the wheels broke through a patch of ice at the edge of the trail. It all happened so quickly. The coach tipped, then slid over the edge. I ran forward, thinking I might somehow help, but the ground beneath me gave way." Vincent could picture the scene all too clearly, the heavy stagecoach plummeting down the ravine, the young woman rushing forward only to be caught in a snow slide herself. "I remember tumbling and then striking my head," Nora continued, one hand unconsciously rising to her temple where a bruise was beginning to form. "After that, just fragments. The cold, trying to walk but being unable to see through the snow, then nothing until I woke here." "It's a miracle you survived," Vincent said quietly. Nora's eyes met his, a warmth in them that belied the tragedy she had just recounted. "Thanks to you." The day passed quietly as the storm raged outside. Vincent found himself drawn to Nora's company, impressed by her resilience and intelligence. Despite her ordeal, she insisted on helping Maggie with dinner preparations, and by evening she was moving with greater ease, though still gingerly. After dinner, they gathered around the fire. Thomas entertained them with tales of his youth in Missouri. And even Vincent, usually reserved, found himself sharing stories of notable cattle drives and local characters. Nora proved to be an excellent listener, her laugh a melodious sound that Vincent found himself working to elicit. She also shared stories of her own anecdotes from the girls' seminary where she had taught, and tales of growing up as the daughter of a railroad surveyor who had taken her along on many of his expeditions. "Father believed girls should know as much about the world as boys," she explained. "My mother died when I was very young, so he raised me as both mother and father. Some might call his methods unconventional, but I'm grateful for the education I received, both formal and practical." "That explains why you're not swooning at the prospect of living in a frontier town," Vincent observed. Nora smiled. "I admit Unionville will be an adjustment after Boston, but I'm looking forward to the challenge. From the correspondence I've had with the school board, there are nearly 40 children in need of education." "Quite a task for one teacher," Maggie remarked. "I'll manage," Nora said with quiet confidence. "Every child deserves the opportunity to learn regardless of where they live." Vincent found himself admiring her conviction. Most Eastern women he had encountered viewed the Nevada Territory as a hardship to be endured rather than a place worthy of investment. As the evening grew late, Nora's eyelids began to droop despite her obvious attempts to stay engaged in the conversation. "You should rest," Vincent said gently. "You're still recovering." Nora nodded reluctantly. "I suppose you're right, though I've already slept most of the day away." Your body needs it, Maggie insisted, helping her to her feet. Come along. I've laid out a nightgown for you. After Nora had retired, Thomas gave Vincent a knowing look. She's something special, that one. Vincent feigned ignorance. Miss Kincaid. Yes, the children of Unionville will be fortunate to have such a dedicated teacher. Thomas snorted. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I haven't seen you look at a woman that way since Sarah Blackburn, and that was years ago. Vincent's expression hardened at the mention of Sarah, a painful chapter in his past he preferred not to revisit. Miss Kincaid is our guest. Nothing more. Thomas raised his hands in surrender. If you say so. But a woman like that won't remain unattached for long once she reaches town. Half the unmarried men in Unionville will come calling, mark my words. The thought was inexplicably irritating, and Vincent changed the subject, discussing plans for clearing the roads once the storm abated. Later, unable to sleep, Vincent sat before the dying fire, his thoughts returning to Nora. Thomas was right, she was exceptional. Intelligent, courageous, and undeniably beautiful. But Vincent had learned the hard way that admiration from afar was safer than risking his heart. Sarah's rejection had taught him that a hard-working rancher with calloused hands and limited formal education held little appeal for an educated woman with refined sensibilities. The following morning brought a temporary break in the storm. Though heavy clouds still hung over the mountains, the snowfall had ceased, and Vincent organized search parties to locate the stagecoach wreckage and check on the cattle in the further pastures. I'd like to come with you to search for the stagecoach, Nora announced at breakfast, her tone indicating she expected argument. Vincent studied her across the table. She looked better today, her color had returned and the haunted look had faded from her eyes, though the bruise on her temple had darkened. It's dangerous terrain, he said carefully. I'm aware, but I feel responsible in a way if we find. She paused, swallowing hard. If we find Mr. Jenkins or Mr. Holloway, I'd like to say a proper goodbye. They were kind to me during our brief acquaintance. Vincent understood her sentiment but remained reluctant. You're still recovering. I'm quite well, she interrupted firmly, and I won't be a hindrance. I rode all over the countryside with my father and can handle a horse as well as most men. Maggie made a disapproving noise from the stove. It's no place for a lady, out in that cold, possibly viewing. She trailed off, unwilling to voice what they might find. Nora's chin lifted slightly. I've seen death before, Mrs. Miller. My father died in my arms after a survey accident. I won't faint at the sight of mortality. There was such quiet dignity in her words that Vincent found his objections fading. Very well. But you'll ride with me, and if at any point I think the conditions are too dangerous, you'll return with one of the hands. Agreed. Agreed, Nora said, a small smile of triumph playing at her lips. An hour later, they set out, Vincent, Nora, and 4 of his most experienced ranch hands. Nora rode side saddle on a gentle mare named Daisy, wearing Maggie's niece's heavy coat and a borrowed hat pulled low over her ears. Despite her assurances, Vincent noticed she moved stiffly, the lingering effects of her ordeal still apparent. The trail to Eagle Pass was difficult, the new snow deep and treacherous in places. Vincent kept a close eye on Nora, but she handled the conditions with remarkable composure, never complaining despite what must have been considerable discomfort. As they approached the area where Vincent had found her, Nora grew quiet, her gaze scanning the snow-covered landscape with growing tension. It was somewhere near here, she said finally, pointing to a section of trail where the drop-off was particularly steep. The coach went over at that bend, I think. Vincent dismounted and approached the edge cautiously, peering down into the ravine. The fresh snow obscured much of the terrain, but about 100 yards down, He could make out an unnatural shape partially buried in white. "I see it," he confirmed grimly. Jackson, retrieve the ropes from the pack horses. The next hour was spent setting up a rescue line and carefully descending into the ravine. Vincent insisted that Nora remain on the trail with one of the hands, and for once she didn't argue, her face pale as she watched the men make their way down to the wreckage. The stagecoach had been nearly obliterated by the fall, splintered wood, and twisted metal scattered across the ravine floor. The horses, still harnessed to the broken frame, had not survived the plunge. Vincent and his men searched methodically through the wreckage, eventually locating the bodies of Mr. Jenkins and the driver, both killed instantly in the fall. They also recovered several trunks and valises, including one that Nora identified as hers when they brought it up. The grim task of bringing up the bodies took another hour. By the time they finished, the clouds had lowered again, threatening more snow. "We should head back," Vincent decided, eyeing the sky with concern. "We can send word to the sheriff in Unionville once we're home. He'll arrange for proper burials." Nora nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the canvas-wrapped forms secured to the pack horses. She had maintained her composure throughout the recovery operation, but Vincent could see the strain on her face. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly as they began the journey home. "Yes," she replied, then sighed. "No, it's just, they were alive only 2 days ago. Mr. Jenkins was telling me about his grandchildren in Sacramento, and now—" "Death comes suddenly in this country," Vincent said, the words sounding inadequate even to his own ears. "Everywhere," Nora corrected softly. "My father always said that life's uncertainty was what made it precious. We never know which day will be our last, so we must live each one with purpose." Vincent glanced at her with newfound respect. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." A sad smile crossed her face. "He would have liked you, I think. He valued actions over words and what you did for me." She trailed off, seemingly unable to find adequate words. "I'm glad I was there," Vincent said simply. They rode in companionable silence for a time, each lost in thought. The snow began to fall again, gently at first, then with increasing intensity. "Another storm," Vincent observed, concern edging his voice. "We need to pick up the pace." They urged their horses to a faster trot, but the fresh snow made the going difficult. By the time the ranch house came into view, they were all thoroughly chilled and the horses were struggling through drifts that reached their knees. Maggie met them at the door with steaming mugs of coffee laced with whiskey. "Just in time. Another hour and you'd have been caught in the worst of it." After the bodies were placed in the storage shed, where the cold would preserve them, until they could be transported to town, and the horses were tended to, Vincent joined Nora by the fire in the main room. She had changed into dry clothes and wrapped herself in a blanket, but still looked chilled to the bone. "Drink this," he urged, handing her a fresh mug of Maggie's special coffee. Nora accepted it gratefully, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. "Thank you for everything." Vincent sat beside her, stretching his hands toward the fire. "We recovered your trunk. It's a bit battered, but the contents should be largely intact." "That's more than I expected," she admitted. "I'm fortunate in many ways despite the circumstances." They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the wind howling outside and the crackling of the fire. "What made you decide to become a teacher?" Vincent asked finally, genuinely curious. Nora considered the question. "I've always loved learning. Books were my companions growing up, especially during the periods when my father's work took us to remote locations. When I was old enough, it seemed natural to want to share that love with others." She looked at him curiously. "And you? Was ranching always your ambition?" Vincent nodded. This land has been in my family since before I was born. My father built something here, and I couldn't imagine doing anything else with my life." "It's a beautiful legacy," Nora observed, "to have such clear purpose." "And teaching isn't a legacy," Vincent countered. "Shaping young minds seems like important work to me." Nora's smile warmed him more than the fire. "It is, though I sometimes wonder if I might have pursued other paths had circumstances been different." "Such as?" "My father wanted me to study medicine," she admitted. "He arranged for me to apprentice with a doctor friend of his when I was 17. I spent a summer learning anatomy and basic treatments." Her expression grew wistful. "I found it fascinating, but after father died, there was no money for medical school. Teaching was a more practical choice." Vincent was impressed. Few women he knew would have even considered such an unconventional path. "Perhaps someday you could still pursue it." Nora shook her head. "Some dreams must remain just that. Besides, I genuinely love teaching." Their conversation continued through the evening, touching on books they had read, places they had seen, and hopes they held for the future. Vincent found himself revealing thoughts he had never shared with anyone. His occasional loneliness, despite being surrounded by ranch hands. His dreams of expanding the operation to include better breeding stock. His quiet pride in what he had built since his father's death. Nora listened with genuine interest, offering insights that demonstrated her quick intelligence. She spoke of her own dreams not just for herself, but for her future students, whom she hoped to inspire with a love of learning that would serve them throughout their lives. As the evening wore on, Vincent realized with some surprise that he had never felt so at ease with a woman before. There was no pretense with Nora, no coy games or artificial charm. She spoke honestly and listened intently, treating their conversation as an exchange between equals. The storm continued for another 2 days, during which Vincent and Nora fell into a comfortable routine. During the day, she helped Maggie with household tasks or sat with Vincent as he worked on the ranch ledgers, offering occasional suggestions for improvements to his bookkeeping system that he had to admit were sensible. In the evenings, they gathered around the fire, talking, reading, or simply enjoying the companionable silence. On the morning of the 3rd day, they awoke to brilliant sunshine and a world transformed by snow. Every tree branch, every fence post was coated in glistening white, and the sky above was the deep, endless blue that only appears after a winter storm has cleared the air of every impurity. "It's magnificent," Nora breathed as she stood on the porch, wrapped in a borrowed shawl. Vincent, coming to stand beside her, nodded in agreement. One of the compensations for enduring the storms. The moment felt strangely intimate, just the two of them taking in the pristine beauty of the winter landscape. Vincent was acutely aware of her presence beside him, of the subtle scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her dark hair despite days away from her own toiletries. "The road to town should be passable by tomorrow," he said, breaking the spell. "I'll take you to Unionville then, if you feel ready." Something like disappointment flashed in Nora's eyes, so quickly that Vincent wondered if he had imagined it. "Yes, of course. I've imposed on your hospitality for too long already." "It's been no imposition," Vincent assured her quickly. "In fact, He hesitated, uncertain how to express what these days with her had meant to him without sounding forward. "Yes," Nora prompted, turning to face him fully. Vincent cleared his throat. "I've enjoyed your company," he said simply, though the words felt inadequate. A soft smile curved her lips. "And I yours, Mr. Vaughn." "Vincent," he reminded her. "After all we've been through, I think formality is unnecessary." "Vincent," she agreed, his name sounding different, somehow more meaningful in her gentle voice. The rest of the day was spent in preparations for the journey to town. Nora sorted through her recovered trunk, grateful to find most of her belongings intact though somewhat dampened by snow that had seeped in through cracks in the lid. Vincent arranged for a wagon to transport the bodies of Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Holloway to the undertaker in Unionville. The grim duty weighed on him, especially knowing how it would affect Nora to travel alongside the remains of men she had known, however briefly. That evening, their last at the ranch carried a subtle melancholy. Though neither acknowledged it directly, both seemed to sense that something special was ending. Their conversation, usually flowing easily, was punctuated by longer silences and wistful glances. After dinner, as they sat before the fire, Vincent found himself studying Nora's profile, memorizing the delicate curve of her jaw, the way the firelight caught in her dark hair. "Will you call on me in town?" she asked suddenly, turning to meet his gaze with surprising directness. Vincent was momentarily taken aback by the question. "If you wish it," he replied carefully. "I do," Nora said simply. "These days have been difficult in many ways, but also—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've come to value your friendship, Vincent. I would hate to lose it just because circumstances no longer force us into daily company. Friendship." The word both pleased and disappointed him, though he couldn't have explained why. "Of course. I come to town regularly for supplies. Perhaps you would allow me to escort you to dinner at the hotel sometime." Nora's smile brightened. "I would like that very much." Morning brought clear skies and milder temperatures, ideal conditions for the journey to Unionville. After breakfast, Vincent loaded Nora's trunk and valise onto his best wagon, which Thomas had already prepared with clean straw and blankets for comfort. The bodies of Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Holloway, respectfully wrapped, were secured in the back, separated from the passenger area by a canvas partition. Nora emerged from the house in a dark blue traveling dress, her hair neatly pinned beneath a matching bonnet. She looked every inch the respectable schoolteacher, though Vincent couldn't help but remember her as he had first seen her, vulnerable and pale against the snow, fighting for her life. "You look well," he said, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. "Thanks to you and the Millers," she replied, squeezing his hand briefly before settling onto the seat. Maggie bustled out with a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Provisions for the journey," she explained, handing it to Nora. "And a few extra things to tide you over until you can properly stock your pantry." "You're too kind," Nora said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "I don't know how to thank you for all you've done." Maggie waved away her thanks. "You just come visit us when you can. It's been nice having another woman around the place." After final goodbyes were exchanged, Vincent climbed up beside Nora and took the reins. The journey to town would take about 3 hours in the current conditions, a relatively short trip, but one that Vincent found himself wishing could be extended. As they pulled away from the ranch house, Nora turned for one last look. "It's a beautiful place," she said softly. "You should be proud of what you've built here." "Thank you," Vincent replied, oddly touched by her appreciation. "It's not grand, but it's home." "The best homes rarely are grand," Nora observed. "It's the feeling within them that matters." The trail to Unionville wound through pine-covered hills, then descended into the valley where the town had sprung up in the 1860s during the silver boom. Though the richest strikes had played out years earlier, the town had survived as a regional center, serving the needs of ranchers, farmers, and the smaller mining operations that continued in the area. As they traveled, Vincent pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the region's history. Nora listened with evident interest, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated her quick grasp of the area's geography and economics. "The school is at the north end of town," Vincent explained as they crested the final ridge, and Unionville came into view in the valley below. "The teachers' quarters are attached, small but comfortable, from what I recall. Mrs. Patterson lived there for nearly 20 years. I'm sure it will be perfectly adequate," Nora replied. "After spending my childhood in survey camps and tents, I've learned not to be particular about accommodations." Vincent glanced at her with renewed admiration. Most women of his acquaintance would have at least affected concern about the quality of their lodgings. As they descended into town, they drew curious glances from residents out clearing snow from walkways or tending to business. Vincent wasn't surprised news traveled quickly in small communities, and word of the missing stagecoach had likely reached Unionville days ago. Their first stop was the undertaker's establishment, a somber building at the edge of town. Mr. Finch, the proprietor, came out immediately when they pulled up. "We feared the worst when the stage didn't arrive," he said, eyeing the canvas-covered forms in the wagon. "Any survivors?" "Just Miss Kincaid here," Vincent replied, helping Nora down from the wagon. "She's the new schoolteacher. I found her unconscious in the snow near Eagle Pass." Mr. Finch's bushy eyebrows rose as he studied Nora with newfound interest. "A miracle, that. Eagle Pass is treacherous in the best conditions, let alone during a blizzard." "Mr. Vaughn is the miracle," Nora corrected quietly. "He carried me 20 miles to safety through the storm." Vincent felt heat rise to his face as Mr. Finch regarded him with obvious respect. "That's so. Well, the town owes you a debt of gratitude, Vaughn. Good teachers are hard to come by in these parts." After arranging for the proper care of the bodies and promising to provide statements for the official record, Vincent escorted Nora to the mayor's office. Mayor Dawson, a corpulent man with a florid face and expansive whiskers, nearly fell over himself in his haste to welcome Nora to Unionville once he learned who she was. "Miss Kincaid, we feared the worst when the stage didn't arrive. To think you survived such an ordeal, remarkable, simply remarkable." "Thanks entirely to Mr. Vaughn," Nora said, bestowing a warm smile on Vincent that made his chest tighten inexplicably. Mayor Dawson pumped Vincent's hand enthusiastically. "Outstanding service, Vaughn. Outstanding. The town council will want to recognize your heroism formally." Vincent shifted uncomfortably. "That's unnecessary, Mayor. Anyone would have done the same." "Nonsense. Carrying a lady 20 miles through a blizzard. Most men would have perished in the attempt." The mayor turned back to Nora. "Now, Miss Kincaid, we must get you settled. School was to begin next Monday, but under the circumstances, perhaps a delay of a week would be advisable." "That's very considerate, Mayor Dawson, but I'm quite recovered and ready to begin as scheduled," Nora replied firmly. "The children have been without proper instruction for too long already." Mayor Dawson looked impressed by her determination. "As you wish. I'll have Mrs. Dawson show you to the teachers' quarters and help you get situated." He hesitated, then added delicately, "There is the matter of the advance we sent to Carson City for your travel expenses." "The draft is safe in my valise," Nora assured him, reaching into her bag to produce a slightly water-stained envelope. "Though I fear I may need to draw an additional advance for immediate necessities. Some of my belongings were damaged in the accident." Of course," the mayor said expansively. "We can discuss those details later. For now, let's get you settled. Mrs. Dawson was summoned, a plump, kindly woman who immediately took Nora under her wing. Before departing with her, Nora turned to Vincent, her expression soft with unspoken emotion. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said quietly. "What you did for me. "No thanks necessary," Vincent replied, suddenly conscious of the Dawsons watching them with undisguised interest. Nora seemed to sense his discomfort. "Will you call on me? Perhaps Sunday afternoon?" "I'd be honored," Vincent said, meaning it. With a final smile, Nora departed with Mrs. Dawson, leaving Vincent feeling oddly bereft despite the mayor's continued effusive praise. After completing a few errands in town, Vincent returned to the ranch, the journey back seeming longer and lonelier than the outbound trip had been. He told himself it was absurd to miss the company of someone he had known for less than a week. Yet he couldn't deny that the ranch house felt emptier without Nora's presence. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity, as Vincent and his men worked to repair damage from the storm and check on the more distant sections of the herd. Yet despite the physical exhaustion each night brought, Vincent found his thoughts continually straying to Nora, wondering how she was settling in, if the townspeople were welcoming, if she thought of him as often as he thought of her. By Sunday, Vincent was both eager and nervous about his promised visit. He bathed and shaved with extra care, donned his best shirt and coat, and even polished his boots to a shine that drew raised eyebrows from Thomas. "Must be some special occasion," the foreman commented dryly. Vincent ignored the bait, though he caught Maggie hiding a knowing smile as she packed a basket of fresh baked goods for the new teacher. The ride to Unionville seemed to take both forever and no time at all. Before Vincent was quite prepared, he found himself standing on the small porch of the teacher's quarters, a neat clapboard addition to the schoolhouse at the north end of town. Nora answered his knock immediately, as if she had been waiting nearby. The smile that lit her face at the sight of him sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Vincent, please, come in." The teacher's quarters were indeed small, just a parlor, bedroom, and tiny kitchen, but Nora had already made the space her own. Books lined the simple shelves, a colorful quilt brightened the sofa, and vases of pine branches brought a touch of nature indoors. "It's not much," she said, following his gaze, "but it's comfortable." "It suits you," Vincent replied honestly. "How was your first week?" Nora's eyes brightened with enthusiasm as she described her 42 students, ranging in age from 6 to 16, their varying levels of education, and her plans for organizing the curriculum to meet all their needs. "The older boys will be a challenge," she admitted. "They're at that age where they're questioning the value of education compared to working. But I think I've convinced most of them that literacy and mathematics will serve them well regardless of their future occupations." Vincent listened, impressed by her obvious dedication and practical approach. "The whole town's talking about you," he said. "Mrs. Johnson at the Mercantile told me you've won over even the most skeptical parents." Nora blushed at the praise. "They've been very welcoming. Several families have invited me to dinner, and Mrs. Dawson has practically adopted me." Her expression grew more serious. "They also speak very highly of you. You're quite respected in Unionville." Now it was Vincent's turn to feel embarrassed. "I've known most of these people all my life. It's a small community, we look out for each other." "Including rescuing half-frozen strangers in blizzards?" Nora asked, a teasing light in her green eyes. Vincent smiled despite himself. "That was a first, I admit." They settled into comfortable conversation, with Nora sharing amusing anecdotes about her students and Vincent updating her on the recovery efforts after the storm. The afternoon passed quickly, and before Vincent realized it, shadows had lengthened across the parlor floor. "Would you stay for supper?" Nora asked when there was a natural pause in their conversation. "It's nothing elaborate, just a stew I prepared this morning, but there's plenty." "I wouldn't want to impose," Vincent began. "It's not an imposition," Nora interrupted, echoing his own words from days earlier. I'd enjoy the company. Vincent found himself accepting, charmed by her directness. As she busied herself in the small kitchen, he offered to help, and soon they were working side by side, cutting bread, setting the table, and stirring the fragrant stew that bubbled on the stove. There was an easy domesticity to their shared tasks that Vincent found both unfamiliar and deeply appealing. Most of the women he had courted in the past had either been incapable of such practical skills or had considered them beneath their dignity. Over the simple but delicious meal, their conversation deepened, touching on hopes, beliefs, and values in ways that revealed a profound compatibility of outlook despite their different backgrounds. My father used to say that education and experience were the twin pillars of wisdom, Nora said as they lingered over coffee. You need both to truly understand the world. I think that's why I find the West so compelling. It forces one to apply knowledge in practical ways. Many educated people look down on those of us who have learned mostly through experience, Vincent observed. Nora shook her head firmly. Then they're not truly educated, merely schooled. There's a difference. As the evening drew to a close, Vincent found himself reluctant to leave. Something significant was developing between them, something he hadn't expected but now couldn't imagine being without. "May I call on you again?" he asked as he prepared to depart. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Nora replied with refreshing candor. "Perhaps next Saturday." "I understand there's to be a social at the church." "I'd be honored to escort you," Vincent said, his heart lightening at the thought of seeing her again so soon. Over the following weeks, Vincent found every possible excuse to visit Unionville. He escorted Nora to the church social, to dinner at the hotel, and on Sunday afternoon rides through the countryside when weather permitted. Each meeting deepened his admiration for her intelligence, her quiet courage, and her genuine compassion for others. For her part, Nora seemed equally drawn to him. She listened intently when he spoke of the ranch, asked thoughtful questions about his plans for the future, and shared her own thoughts and dreams with a frankness that suggested complete trust. The townspeople noticed their growing attachment, of course. In a community as small as Unionville, little escaped observation. But the general reaction seemed to be approval. Vincent was a respected rancher with deep roots in the community, and Nora had quickly established herself as a dedicated teacher who took genuine interest in her students' welfare. Only Mrs. Prescott, the widow of the former bank manager and self-appointed arbiter of local society, expressed reservations within Vincent's hearing. "She seems a lovely young woman," Mrs. Prescott remarked one day as Vincent was concluding business at the bank, "though perhaps a bit unconventional for our community. Still, I suppose that's to be expected from someone raised in such unusual circumstances." The criticism, mild as it was, sparked an unexpected surge of protectiveness in Vincent. Miss Kincaid's unusual upbringing prepared her exceptionally well for her role here, he replied coolly. "The school board considers her the finest teacher Unionville has ever had." Mrs. Prescott had retreated in the face of his evident displeasure, but the exchange left Vincent pondering his own feelings. When had his admiration for Nora deepened into something more profound? By early March, as the first hints of spring began to soften the winter landscape, Vincent could no longer deny the truth to himself. He had fallen in love with Nora Kincaid. The realization both exhilarated and terrified him. Would an educated woman like Nora consider a life with a rancher whose formal schooling had ended at age 15? Could she be happy so far from the cultural amenities of a city like Boston? These questions troubled Vincent as he prepared for their Saturday, ride a ritual that had become the highlight of each week. Nora had proven herself an excellent horsewoman, comfortable in the saddle for hours at a time as they explored the valleys and foothills surrounding Unionville. Today, he had planned to show her a particular meadow that would soon be carpeted with the first wildflowers of spring. It was one of his favorite places on his property, a secluded spot where a small stream emerged from the hillside to create a natural garden unlike any other in the region. Nora was waiting on the small porch of the teacher's quarters when he arrived with the horses. She wore a practical riding habit of deep green that complemented her eyes, and her dark hair was braided and pinned securely beneath a matching hat. "You look lovely," Vincent said, meaning it. Nora smiled, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "Thank you. Where are we bound today?" "There's a place on the north section of my property I'd like to show you," he replied, helping her mount the mare she had come to favor for their excursions. "It's about an hour's ride." The day was mild for early March. The sky a clear, pale blue that promised true spring wasn't far away. As they rode, Nora pointed out various plants beginning to emerge from their winter dormancy, demonstrating a knowledge of botany that continuously surprised Vincent. "My father believed understanding the natural world was essential," she explained when he commented on her expertise. "He hired a botanist to accompany one of his survey expeditions and insisted I learn everything the man knew." "Your father sounds like a remarkable man," Vincent observed. "He was," Nora agreed, a touch of sadness in her smile. "I think that's partly why I was drawn to teaching to honor his belief in the importance of education." They reached the meadow just as the sun reached its zenith, bathing the protected valley in golden light. Though most of the landscape remained in winter's grip, here the first green shoots were pushing through the soil, and early crocuses had already begun to bloom in scattered patches. "It's beautiful," Nora breathed as they dismounted and secured the horses. "How did you find this place?" "I got lost during a snowstorm when I was 12, Vincent admitted. "My father found me here the next morning, huddled under that outcropping. I've always felt it was a special spot." They spread a blanket near the stream, and Nora unpacked the lunch she had prepared: cold chicken, fresh bread, early spring greens, and apple tarts that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon. As they ate, Vincent found himself watching Nora more than enjoying the view. The sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and her face had taken on a healthy glow that erased all traces of the ordeal that had first brought her into his life. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching his gaze. Vincent hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I was thinking how grateful I am for that storm in December." Nora's eyebrows rose. "Grateful for a blizzard that nearly killed me and did kill 2 others." "Not for that," Vincent clarified quickly. "Never for that. But if not for the storm, our paths might never have crossed." He paused, gathering his courage. "And meeting you has been the greatest blessing of my life." The words hung between them, more revealing than Vincent had intended but nonetheless true. Nora's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his hand where it rested on the blanket. "I've thought the same thing," she admitted quietly. "Not about the storm exactly, but about how sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the greatest joys." Vincent turned his hand to clasp hers, his heart hammering in his chest. "Nora, I need to tell you something." "Yes," she prompted when he fell silent, struggling for words. "I'm not a man of fancy education or refined manners," he began awkwardly. "I know there are things I can't offer you that you might find in a city or with a different sort of man, but what I lack in those areas, I make up for in other ways." He drew a deep breath. "I love you, Nora. I think I began falling in love with you that first night by the fire, when you spoke of your father's belief that life's uncertainty made it precious." Nora's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Vincent, you don't have to answer now, he said quickly. I know it hasn't been long and you might need time to consider what a life here would mean compared to the opportunities you might have elsewhere, but I wanted you to know how I feel. Vincent, Nora tried again, squeezing his hand. I don't need time to consider. I love you too. The simple declaration struck Vincent with the force of a physical blow. You do? Nora laughed, the sound like music in the quiet meadow. Yes, you wonderful, oblivious man, I've been in love with you since. Well, I'm not entirely sure when it happened. Perhaps when you sat beside me hour after hour during the storm, making sure I was warm enough, telling me stories to keep my spirits up. Or maybe it was later, when you showed such respect for my work and my ideas. Vincent felt a joy so intense it was almost painful expanding in his chest. Without conscious thought, he leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. I never thought I'd find someone like you, he murmured. Someone who understands what this life means to me, who shares my values, who challenges me to be better. And I never thought I'd find a man who valued my mind as much as my company, Nora replied. Who sees me as an equal partner rather than someone to be protected or instructed. Vincent sat back, still holding her hands in his. Will you marry me, Nora? Will you share this life with me, the ranch, the community, whatever the future holds? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Though I'd like to finish the school year first, I promised the children and the school board. Of course, Vincent agreed immediately. I wouldn't ask you to abandon your commitment. That dedication is part of what I love about you. They spent the remainder of the afternoon in the meadow, talking of their future together, sharing kisses and making plans. By the time they reluctantly mounted their horses for the return journey, the shadows had lengthened and the air had grown cooler. Will you tell the Millers? Nora asked as they rode side by side along the trail back to town. Vincent grinned. Maggie will claim she knew from the start. She's been dropping hints for weeks. She's a wise woman, Nora observed with a smile. I look forward to learning from her. I'm a decent cook, but my skills at managing a ranch household are somewhat untested. Maggie will be delighted to have another woman at the ranch, Vincent assured her. She's been trying to convince Thomas to build a separate house for them for years, but he always refuses, saying she'd miss having people to look after. Perhaps with a new mistress of the house, he'll reconsider, Nora suggested. They deserve their own home after all these years of service. Vincent nodded thoughtfully. You're right. It's time I saw to that. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Unionville, met with general approval and congratulations. The school board, after initial concern about losing their teacher, expressed support when Nora assured them she would complete the school year and help select her replacement. Mayor Dawson was particularly effusive in his congratulations. A perfect match, he declared at a small dinner party held in their honor at the hotel. Our finest rancher and our most dedicated teacher, Unionville, couldn't be more pleased. Even Mrs. Prescott, unbent enough to offer good wishes, though she couldn't resist adding, the ranch is quite isolated in winter, my dear. I do hope you won't find the solitude too trying. On the contrary, Nora replied pleasantly. I've always found that good company is more important than quantity of company, and I'll have the best company of all. Spring advanced rapidly across the Nevada landscape, as Nora completed her teaching duties and prepared for the wedding, which they had set for the first Saturday in June. Vincent, with Thomas's help, began construction on a separate house for the Millers near the main ranch house, a wedding gift that brought tears to Maggie's eyes when he announced it. It's long overdue, Vincent told her. You and Thomas have been the backbone of this ranch for most of my life. Consider it a small token of my appreciation." Nora divided her time between her teaching duties and learning the operations of the ranch, absorbing everything Maggie and Vincent could teach her about the daily routines that kept the enterprise running smoothly. Her quick intelligence and practical nature made her a natural partner in the business, and Vincent often found himself wondering how he had managed without her insights. As the wedding day approached, Nora received an unexpected letter from Boston. A former colleague at the girls' seminary had read about her engagement in a newspaper exchange and written to express surprise and congratulations. "Amelia can't quite believe I'm marrying a rancher in Nevada," Nora said with amusement as she read the letter aloud to Vincent during one of their evening rides. She writes, "All of Boston society expected you to accept Professor Harrington's offer and become the wife of one of Harvard's most distinguished scholars. To think you've chosen instead a life in the wilderness. I can only conclude that this Mr. Vaughn must be quite extraordinary." Vincent's eyebrows rose. "Professor Harrington, you never mentioned a proposal." Nora folded the letter carefully. "It wasn't worth mentioning. Herbert Harrington is a brilliant mathematician but a thoroughly unpleasant man. His proposal was more a business arrangement than a declaration of affection. Still, Harvard professor versus Nevada rancher seems like a significant choice," Vincent observed, unable to keep a trace of insecurity from his voice. Nora reined her horse to a stop, waiting until Vincent did the same before speaking. "Herbert Harrington saw me as an appropriate accessory to his academic career, educated enough to be presentable at faculty functions, but malleable enough not to challenge his authority. You see me as a partner in every sense." Her green eyes held his steadily. "It wasn't even a choice, Vincent. Not really." Vincent felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest at her words. Every day brought new reasons to love this remarkable woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers across the valley. The ceremony was held in the town church, filled to capacity with well-wishers from Unionville and surrounding ranches. Nora wore a simple gown of ivory silk, adorned only with a spray of wildflowers from their special meadow, which Vincent had gathered at dawn. "You look beautiful," he whispered as they stood before the minister, hands joined. Nora's answering smile was radiant. "And you look very handsome, Mr. Vaughn." The reception that followed at the hotel was the social event of the season, with Mayor Dawson delivering a speech that referenced the dramatic circumstances of their meeting no fewer than 3 times. Even Thomas was persuaded to offer a toast, his normally gruff manner softened by evident affection for both bride and groom. "To Vincent and Nora," he said, raising his glass. "May your life together be as steadfast as the mountains and as bright as Sierra sunshine." As the celebration continued around them, Vincent drew Nora onto the hotel's small veranda for a moment of privacy. "Happy?" he asked, searching her face in the golden light of sunset. "Completely," she assured him, reaching up to touch his cheek. "This is just the beginning of our story, Vincent. Think of all we have ahead of us." "A lifetime isn't long enough," he murmured, drawing her into his arms, "but it's a good start." They returned to the ranch that evening as husband and wife, to a home Maggie had prepared with special care, adding touches of beauty and comfort to welcome the new mistress of the house. In the years that followed, Vincent and Nora built a life that exceeded even their most hopeful expectations. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, with Nora's organizational skills complementing Vincent's practical knowledge of cattle and land management. They expanded operations to include a small apple orchard and beehives, Nora's special projects that proved surprisingly profitable. 2 years after their wedding, Nora gave birth to a son they named James after her father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 18 months later, and another son, Daniel, 3 years after that. The children grew strong and curious in the fresh mountain air, benefiting from their mother's dedication to education and their father's patient instruction in the practical skills of ranch life. Though she no longer taught formally, Nora never lost her commitment to education. She established a small library at the ranch that became a resource for neighboring families, and during winter months when travel to town was difficult, she held informal classes for the children of the ranch hands. Vincent, watching his wife reading to their children before the fire on winter evenings, often marveled at the strange twist of fate that had brought her into his life. That desperate journey through the blizzard, carrying her half-frozen body 20 miles to safety, had led to a happiness greater than anything he could have imagined. On the 10th anniversary of the day he had found her in the snow, Vincent took Nora back to their special meadow, now in full summer bloom. They picnicked beneath the same outcropping where he had proposed, their children racing through the wildflowers, their laughter echoing against the distant mountains. "You ever regret it?" Vincent asked as they watched James teaching Elizabeth how to identify different butterflies, a skill Nora had taught him the previous summer. "Regret what?" Nora asked, turning to him with a puzzled smile. "Staying here. Choosing this life instead of returning to the East, to cities and culture and all the things you knew before." Nora's expression softened as she took his hand in hers. "Not for a single moment. This is where I belong, Vincent, with you, with our children in this beautiful, challenging country." She looked out over the meadow at their 3 healthy children, at the distant profile of the ranch that had become her home. "That day in the snow, I thought it was the end of my story. Instead, it was just the beginning." Vincent drew her close, overwhelmed as always by the depth of his love for this extraordinary woman. "The best beginning," he murmured against her hair. "The very best," Nora agreed, turning her face up for his kiss as their children's laughter carried on the summer breeze the sweet music of a life built on courage, commitment, and a love born in the most unexpected circumstances. In the years that followed, the Vaughn Ranch became known throughout Nevada territory for its hospitality, progressive farming practices, and the educational opportunities it provided, not just for the Vaughn children but for any young person in the region with a desire to learn. Nora's small library grew into a substantial collection that drew visitors from as far as Carson City, and the informal classes she offered expanded to include adult education for ranch hands who wanted to improve their literacy or mathematical skills. Vincent and Nora faced challenges, of course, harsh winters, economic downturns, and the ordinary struggles of raising a family in frontier conditions. But they faced each difficulty as they had from the beginning, together, with mutual respect and unwavering commitment. Their children grew into capable, educated adults who carried forward their parents' values. James eventually took over management of the ranch, implementing innovations that increased productivity while preserving the land for future generations. Elizabeth became a doctor, fulfilling the dream her mother had once set aside, establishing a practice in Unionville that served the medical needs of the entire region. Daniel combined his father's ranching knowledge with his mother's love of teaching, eventually founding an agricultural college that trained young people in sustainable farming practices. And through it all, Vincent and Nora remained at the center, partners in every sense, their love deepening with each passing year. On winter evenings, they still told the story of their first meeting to grandchildren gathered around the fire, the tale of a blizzard, a desperate journey through the snow, and the extraordinary twist of fate that had brought them together. It wasn't fate, Nora would always correct gently. It was your grandfather's courage and determination. He carried me 20 miles through a blizzard when most men would have perished in the attempt. And Vincent would smile at the wonder in the children's eyes, knowing that the true miracle wasn't that he had found Nora in the snow or carried her to safety, but that she had chosen to build a life with him, a life richer and more fulfilling than either of them could have imagined on that winter day when their paths first crossed.